General Secretary of the Asiatic Society, Bangladesh, Professor Siddiqur Rahman Khan Sahab, Vice President of the Society, Shojan Sahab, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor for me to come to the Asiatic Society, which is a very prestigious and premier seat of learning. The society which beacons the scholarship of the East as well as the West. So many illustrious scholars have been associated with this society right from the time of Professor Hassan Dani. It has been modeled in a way to celebrate anything which is essentially important and significant to nature, to globe. With this spirit, we try our investigation into every part of Asia, try to know what are the visual objects, what are the tangible and intangible heritage, what are the documents, how intellectual development of human being takes place in this part of the world. Asia as a continent and Asia as a civilizational zone or civilizational discourse or civilizational notion, both are very important in the sense that we have three highly significant and fruitful civilizations in this spans of the earth, namely the Chinese civilization, the Persian civilization, and the Indian civilization. A continent which houses three important civilizations, and they have been playing an important role from time immemorial. So in this discourse, we would like to investigate and show that how every part of Asia is so coherent and connected with each other. That is the lead motive of our entire planning, that how every part of Asia, how every particle of Asia, how every atom of Asia constitutes the corpus of Asia. And what is important in all these segments which we will be discussing this evening is that these cultures which are part of different parts of Asia, they happen to be cousin cultures. They contribute to the development of man and society, and they build the life and society, life and letters in such a way that there is a continuum. You will never find that there has been any interruption in that civilizational discourses which have been taking place over a millennia. Now, going back to the dawn of civilization, we could see that the early dawn of civilization, where we could witness the emergence of two important religions of Asia. One was Buddhism and the other was Zoroastrianism. Of course, Buddhism and Zoroastrianism are not a very vibrant and dominant practicing religions today, but their artifacts and their relics which are there in our museum, that again establish the fact that how interconnected we are. The concept of Zoroastrianism, which is enshrined in three different principles: good action, good speech, and good thought. Pindarani, Guftarani, Kirdarani. How these three concepts shaped the early Persian civilization or Iranian civilization in Central Asian part of this continent. Again, with the emergence of Buddha on the scene of South Asia, we could see that he delivered the message of the eightfold path. that these eightfold paths would indeed bring an end to human sufferings. The end of human sufferings is shrined in his teachings of eightfold path. Now the teachings are not so much rampant, they were not so much rife, and they could not be communicated through the medium of writings. So the Buddha panel was sculpted. You could see the stones bearing the images of Buddha all through from Southeast Asia down to South Asia and then going to Central Asia, connecting a vast expanse of Asian continent. Even if you today visit any museum of Asia, whether it is Chennai or Kolkata or Delhi or Lahore, Peshawar, Charsadda, Mardan, Kabul, Dushanbe, Tirmiz, anywhere you will go, you will find different images of Buddha in different forms. The sleeping Buddha, the starving Buddha, the standing Buddha. So Buddha in different incarnations, in different postures and in different forms are exhibited, and they are today in our museums. And they celebrate that Asian union, what we call the Asian union. Similarly, the concept of good speech and good thought and good action, that was there in Iran, in erstwhile Persian civilization, but after the Arab conquest of Iran, what happened? Islam and Iran came in direct contact with each other. With this intermingling of Islam and Persian civilization, what unfolded was very interesting, that the teachings of Zoroastrianism did not go in vain. They negotiated with the Islam of Arabia and blossomed in a different form. Or even the teachings of Buddhism did not go waste with the downfall of Buddhism. We could see that they morphed, they changed themselves in the form of Sufism. So in Iran, the narrative is different altogether. The impact of Islam was felt on Iran in such a manner that for 200 years the Iranians did not have their language, the language which they used to speak, write and communicate, namely the Pahlavi and the Avestan languages. But what happened that in course of these 200 years, they adopted the Arabic script. The Persians adopted the Arabic script and added something more to that script which the Arabs did not have. So the genius of Asian people lies in the fact that they are always in a mode of invention. They try to invent something in the given situation. So the four letters which the Persians had and the Arabs did not have, the sound, that is one pe, che, ga, and then you have je. So these four letters they added to the Arabic alphabet and invented a Perso-Arabic alphabet to write their Neo-Persian language. This Neo-Persian language, where did it occur? How did it come into existence after 200 years? It occurred in a place called Mavrauna or Transoxiana, or what we call Central Asia in our day-to-day conversation and in day-to-day jazz. In this part of Central Asia, what we see is emergence of a new language. Now this language faced a direct rivalry with Arabic language. Arabic, the language of the eloquent. Arabic was considered to be the language of the eloquent, and the rest of the world was ajam. That means the rest of the world could not speak the language. So in that part of the world we could see for the first time the Iranians were developing their language and literature. I would like to submit here that the three elements which go a long way in building a civilization or culture. One is the language, the other is the literature, and third is the religion. So we could see the birth of new Persian language and also the emergence of a new language called, new literature called Persian literature, which is written in Perso-Arabic character, and then you have the emergence of Sufism in that part of Asia. These three components were very vital in shaping the cultural development of the people of that region. Earlier also we had seen that how when the Greeks had come and they had lived in that part of Asia for a long time, so what they did, they introduced their own script, that is the Greek script, and Persian language came to be written in that script, which came to be known as the Bactrian language. Of course, we don't know Bactrian language today, only there are one or two scholars who are familiar with Bactrian language. So Bactrian language was a language which was written in Greek character, but the language was not Greek, the language was Persian, Old Persian, and which came to be known as the Bactrian language and the Soghdi language. And here also we could see that Brahmi and Khurushti scripts were used to write Indo, or what they call Arya Bhasha. Now, this tryst of Asian people with language, literature and religion have given birth to a kind of culture which is known as cousin culture. And these cousin cultures are always complementary with each other. They keep on going, enriching each other. It is not that one belittles at the cost of which the other glorifies itself. That was never the syndrome or the phenomenon. We could see that these cousin cultures, they have been supplemented. For example, the glaring example of this cousin culture happened to be the building of the Taj Mahal. You could see the Taj Mahal from the depth of Indian Ocean, from the towering height of the mountains of Central Asia, jade stones and other stones were taken out. And then you could see that how the Rajput Chhatris were introduced there. And one could see that the perforated grills of the temples were added to that structure. And finally, the crowning glory of the Taj is the Islamic dome, which has come from Central Asia, for which Tagore has said it is music in stone. Or for that matter, Iqbal talks about Taj Mahal, that it is poetry in stone. So poetry per se is not only manifested in words and meters, in language and literature, one could see the appearance of poetry even in inanimate objects like stone. Poetry is infused in stone also. That is the beauty of poetry. The significance of poetry lies in Persian language in the sense that the crowning glory of Persian literature is not its prose, but its poetry. And the birthplace of this poetry is a place called Bukhara. Bukhara, which happens to be the heart of Central Asia at one point of time. What happened? That a poet who was born to a family whose name was Rudaki. You know, the Arabs, Nizami Sahab would vouch for me that the Arabs took pride in their family having given birth to a poet rather than to a king. So in Arabic civilization, if a poet is born to a family and a king is born to a family, the family would take pride in the poet rather than in the king. That is the Arabic tradition. And Arabs, when they had written the Sab'a Mu'allaqa, and hung it on the walls of Kaaba. They used to take pride in their poetry. But who would give a befitting reply to the Arabs as far as poetry is concerned? There was no other nation, there was no other people than the Persians. What the Persians did, they learned poetry from the Arabs, because all the poetic forms which are there in Persian literature, they are all borrowed forms from poetry, from the Arabic poetry. But the Arabs did not have the genius to find out what wealth and jewel they have in their poetry. For example, I will just discuss one form of poetry which is known as qasida. That is the predominant form of poetry in Arabic literature. You have only qasida. But what is embedded in the qasida, the Arabs did not detect it. They considered qasida as one corpus. But when the Persians were trying, experimenting with this form of poetry, they found that there is part of qasida which is taghazzul, and they carved out that taghazzul. They took out that part of taghazzul and made it a separate form of poetry which is known as ghazal, which the Arabs were not aware of, that there would be ghazal in their qasida. But it was again the genius of Iran, the genius of Iranians, who detected the existence of ghazal in qasida, and they took out and gave it a separate identity. And today you find that ghazal is the most popular poetic form in our Asian discourse. Even in Bengali literature, you have ghazal as a poetic form. All the poets are using ghazal. Urdu literature is predominantly a ghazal poetry. Similarly, in other literature also, you could see all the Asian literatures who have ghazal, thanks to the efforts of the Iranians who had given it a separate identity and separate form. Coming back to Rudaki, who is considered to be the father of Neo-Persian poetry. Now, when Rudaki was living in the 10th century in Bukhara, Bukhara was a place at that time which was ruled by a dynasty known as the Samanid dynasty or Samanid dynasty. They were very famous people, those rulers who had ruled Central Asia under the Samanid rule. What did they do? They were the people who established peace and prosperity in the region. When they had peace and prosperity, entire Central Asia turned out to be a land of milk and honey. And people were rejoicing, there was abundance of wealth. They had no war, they had no enemy, no adversary, and they patronized poetry and music. Now, poetry and music, when you have poetry goes hand in glove with music. One is the shadow of the other. If one is the body, the other is the shadow. So we have earlier also, we have dynasties like the Sasanian dynasties, which was pre-Islamic dynasty. And post-Islamic dynasty, which we had in Iran, was Samanid dynasty. So a poet, Mujalladi, Shahid Mujalladi, he said that from all the treasures hoarded by the houses of Sasan and Saman, nothing survives except the songs of Barbar. Nothing exists, fades, Rudaki's sweet lays. So the songs of Barbar and the poetry of Rudaki, only these two objects have survived till date. And what about the treasures which was hoarded by the houses of Sasan and Saman? They have all gone into waste. The 7, Iram indeed is born with all its roads. Jamshid's 7-ringed cup where no one knows, but still the wine her ancient ruby is, and still a garden by the water glows. So the eternal thing which remains in our civilization is not body politics, is not diplomacy, is not the wealth we hoard on one pretext or the other. The eternal objects which we cherish and which we possess and which continue to remain with us is music and poetry. Now Rudaki, being a poet par excellence and pan-Semonite period, or pan-Oxian period, what type of poetry did he write? What was there in the poetry of Rudaki that is still we celebrate it? The poetry which Rudaki has written happens to be very simple in words, but highly powerful in emotions. The words are simple, but the emotions are highly powerful. Now he writes about the poetry, it is not something very difficult of subject which he is dealing, and he is not adopting any complicated mode of expression. His expression is simple and the subject matter of poetry is simpler. What is the poetry he is writing? He is writing a poetry about a place in Bukhara. The name of that place is Muye Julian. Muye Mulyan is a stream in the quarter called Mulyan. So in Bukhara, in the 11th century, there was a place called Mulyan, and there used to pass a stream. It was known as Jew. So Mulyan, that was the name of that place. And who lived in that area? The king had ordered that all his ministers, noblemen, men of letters, men of literature, men of science, men of art, they all had their quarters with beautiful gardens. And the place was not only beautiful, but the people were also beautiful. What in Arabic it is said that Sharaful Makan Minal Makin. The Makin, those people who live in that area, bestows respectability to the area. Area does not, the locality does not give sharaf to the people. Sharaful Makan Minal Makin. The Makin gives sharaf to Makan. So those people who lived in that area, they were also there. So the king had gone to Iraq and he was not returning back to Bukhara. And for 4 years, and these army generals and his entourage and everybody, they got homesick. And they invoked Rudaki to compose a poem so that the king would return back to his capital. And then Rudaki composed that poem, Hue Jue Mulyan Ayat Hami, Yade Yare Meherban Ayat Hami, Rige Amu Durushti Hayuru, Zire Payam Parnyan Ayat Hami. We, the Jue Mulyan, we call to mind and long for those dear friends long left behind. The sands of Oxus, though toilsome they be, beneath my feet were soft as silk to me. Now the soil of the sands of Oxus, which happened to be coarse object, was felt as soft silk by Rudaki. And he recollected that Mulyan, the fragrance of Mulyan, the fragrance of the stream of Mulyan. Now having composed this segment of poetry, it's an ode to Bukhara. Now this relationship between the poet and the city is somewhat very strange. That could only be understood by examining some other forms and samples of poetry, where one could see that how the poets who lived in a particular city, how they had a sense of belonging to that city. Or I'll just give you one of the examples from modern day, or from our living memory rather, that you could see that Wordsworth had lived in London. So he wrote a poem, it is an ode to London, Westminster Bridge, where he talks about dull would he be of soul, who would pass by a sight so touching in its majesty. He tries to look at London as somewhat very pure place, and it had a throbbing heart. The city of London is compared with a throbbing heart, and he would say that anybody who would not take notice of the city of London, he would be a dull man. Or, for example, when we had Mir Taqi Mir, who was a poet from Delhi, he had gone to Lucknow, and people could not recognize him, that he was Mir, and they asked him that you seem to be a stranger in our land. You are coming from where? Then he said, क्या बूढ़ो बाश पूछो हो पूरब के कातिल, हमको गरीब जान के हंस हंस पुकार के, दिल्ली जो एक शहर था आलम में इंतखाब, रहते थे मुंतखब ही जहाँ रोजगार के, जिसको फलक ने लूट के वीरान कर दिया, हम रहने वाले हैं उसी उजड़े दियार के. Now this is how the city is being celebrated in poetry. What Rudaki has talked about Bukhara in his poetry is not simply the description of a locality of Bukhara. It has gone down into history in the sense that he had given us zameen. That zameen, what we call the poetic, the metrical pattern. In poetry, it's a technical term, zameen. That means in a metrical pattern, one has to compose a poem. Now this poem, which was composed by Rudaki in a metrical pattern, Buye Jue Mulyan Ayathami, Yade Yare Meherban Ayathami, it became a standard form of a template of communication. That means after Rudaki, whoever would come and compose poetry must try his hand in this metrical pattern. That was the metrical pattern which was evolved by Rudaki, and it went down all through the ages. Rudaki lived in the 10th century. After 400 years of Rudaki, you have Hafiz. Hafiz, when he comes and he tries to lament upon the sad affairs of Shiraz, particularly here. So he also invokes Rudaki. He says that we should transport ourselves to the land of Buye Jue Mulyan, where there was sincerity. People were not hypocrite. People had audacity. People had courage. They were sincere, they were friendly, they epitomized Persian culture. So he also invokes the same metrical pattern of Rudaki to compose his ghazal, which is a very famous ghazal. Again, when we come to the 21st century, there are so many poets. Amir Khusro has tried the same metrical pattern. So many other poets, they have tried the same metrical pattern, but the credit goes to Rudaki for evolving this metrical pattern for a better communication with our present day life. For example, when Sir Syed had built the Anglo-Muslim college in Aligarh, he was in dire need of donation. There were zamindars and nawabs and government officials and philanthropes who were eager to give money to Sir Syed and would come and say their respect to him. So a man called Asman Jah, who was a minister in Hyderabad, Dakar, he wanted to come to Aligarh, to pay his respect to Sir Syed for building such a beautiful college, Anglo-Muslim College, Anglo-Oriental College, which came to be known as Aligarh Muslim University in later years. So Sir Syed asked Shibli to welcome Asmanja, who was coming from Hyderabad. So the Nizam was coming from Hyderabad, and he was again. Shibli also invoked the same metrical pattern of Rudaki, which was there in Central Asia, say a millennium back, and there also he said, "Hum chenin bashi gar mein guftagu hasid az bab na kahan ayat hami afkanat shure mubawra baudo pas in hadithash bar zaman ayat hami asmanja aswe mulke dakan janibe Hindustan ayat." We were busy in our conversation. The messenger came with the happy tidings that Asmanja was coming from the land of Deccan to the land of India. Now, you see, this is the way one would converse, and Persian poetry had given the template of conversation to all our cultural areas where poets were trying to write poetry. Where is Bukhara? Where is 10th century? And where is Hafiz? He was in Shiraz, and he was in the 14th century. Shibli was here in North India, and he belonged to the 20th century. But how that template, which was formulated by, which was developed by Rudaki in such a simple form, came to be used by poets at different places and times in Asia. That is the power of poetry. When we look at the scenario, Indian scenario, that dynasties after dynasties, kingdoms after kingdoms, they were formed, they had their rise, and then they had their sudden fall. But during all this period in South Asia, the most important form of communication was taking place in Persian language. Right from the time of Sultanate period down to the time of Iqbal, one could see that in one millennium how Persian language played its role in the development of culture and literature. The beauty of Mughal culture is not there in architecture, but it is in poetry. People are more fascinated with architecture because that is very visual. It is easier to see the art of Mughal culture. But the Mughal culture is prominently manifested in poetry. Now, what poetry is there in Mughal time? We must examine that who were the movers and shakers of this form of poetry. We have to identify them. So you could see that after the Samanites, those people who played vital role in Asia for shaping and giving a distinct identity to poetry and culture were the Turks, not the Persians. If you take five big names of Indian poets who lived in different periods of time, Amir Khusro, Faizi, Bedil, Ghalib and Iqbal, none of them was Persian. Khusro was a Turk, Faizi was a Yemeni, Bedil was a Turk, Ghalib was a Turk, and Iqbal was a Brahman. So they were not Persians, but how much they pooled their energy and how much they invested their intellect in building this Persian poetry. The corpus of Persian poetry is beyond our imagination. The productive work which they have left, if anybody would write the intellectual history of Asia, would be at loss to understand that what mammoth, what huge amount of literature they have left, which is still, we have only picked up a few pebbles from the coastline. We have not entered into the deep sea of Persian literature. For example, divans, there were 5 divans of Amir Khusro, and all the 5 divans have not been edited. It's very amazing that a poet of the stature of Amir Khusro, that all the 5 divans of Amir Khusro are not edited. They are available in static form. Or everybody would like to read it, they are available in unedited form. That is one part of the story. And still we have not been able to cover the entire corpus of Persian poetry. Now, the 5 poets, let me go before the advent of the Mughal period, when we go to the Sultanate period of our South Asian history, we find that what is the most prominent feature of poetry? The most prominent feature of poetry is not the carnal love and longing, it is Sufism. The introduction of Sufism in poetry, which took place only in Persia, was a great phenomenon. It was an epoch-making event. What difference did it make because poetry with Sufism and poetry without Sufism? What some great Russian intellectual said, that poetry without Sufism is prose. That is one saying about poetry and Sufism, that how essential element Sufism is in poetry. So we could see that what Sufism has given to poetry. In fact, Islam was a religion of obedience. It always entails obey God. But when Sufism comes, it does not say you obey God, it says you love God. So the message of love, which is enshrined in Sufism, it enters into the arteries of poetry and infuses a fresh blood in the body of poetry. And that beautiful poetry, what Rumi is famous for Sufism. Somebody says that he's not a poet, he's a Sufi, because we don't have that type of course in Ghazal he is poet, but in Masnavi we don't find Rumi more as a poet. He is more a Sufi in Masnavi rather than in Ghazal. In Masnavi, when Rumi he blurs that feeling of me and the other, we and others. There is no we and others in Sufism. And what he said that an yaki amad dare yari beza guft bardar kisti motamad guft man guftash boro hangam neez par sare khani maqam kham neez khamra juz aatash hajru firaq ki fazad ki wa rehana daz nifaq رفت ان مسکین و سالی در سفر در فراق دوست سوزید از شرف پخته شد انسوخته چون باز گشت باز گرده خانه باز گشت حلقه زد بر در به 100 ترس و ادب تا به نجهد بی ادب لب زید لب بانگ زد یارش که بر در کیست گفت بردر هم توی ای دل. An immature lover came and he knocked at the door of his friend. The friend cried, who is at the door? He said, I. He said, who are you? This is not the place for the immature and raw person. The raw lover went away, and in the fire of separation he burned himself and he became mature. And having become mature, he again reappeared at the door with lots of apprehension and fear and caution. And this time he knocked the door. And again the lover asked, who is at the door? He doesn't say I, he said you. Now when he said you that come, there is no difference between you and me. This is how Sufism celebrates. And the same idea has been encouched in the poetry of Amir Khusro. Amir Khusro also tries to toy with the same idea of Sufism, where he says, Man to shudam, to man shudi, man tan shudam, to chan shudi, ta kasnabu yad badazim, man didaram, to didaram. I became you, you became me, I became body and you became soul to dwell in it. Lest nobody would say that you are different and I am different. So that complete union, the dissolving of self and becoming selfless, that Bekhudi is really celebrated in the Sufi poetry of Amir Khusro or Rumi. But when we come during the period of Mughal India, the scenario changed. We have a special type of diction in poetry which is known as Sabke Hindi. This Sabke Hindi is a school of Indian school of poetry. In this Indian school of poetry, the emphasis is more on expression rather than content. The form becomes more important rather than the content. But again, there were poets who rose to the position of poet laureates. There were 5 important poet laureates. But we consider the 4 more important. One is Faizi, who adorned the court of Akbar the Great. Then you have Abu Talib Kalim, who was a poet of Shah Jahan. Then Talib Amuli, who was a poet of Jahangir. And finally you had Bedil, who belonged to the period of Aurangzeb. So the great Mughal, the 4 great Mughals, namely Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb, they characterize different persona. What is the persona of Akbar? Akbar was more open to philosophy. He was interested in philosophical discourses and debates. He would invite the Jesuits and the Jain monks and Munis and the Sufis and everybody. And he would pass sleepless night with them discoursing religion, whether God is 1 or 1.5 or 2 or 2.5, what is the number of God and how he could negotiate Sulh-e-Kul. So if the poet would look what is the tendency of his master, because there is a philosophical bent of mind in Akbar. The same philosophy is reflected in the poetry which was composed during the period of Akbar. For example, yes, I've given one example from Faizi. So Faizi, what does he do? He talks about the sky, the firmament. In poetry, we have a belief that all our misfortunes come from heaven. And we see the blue firmament very hostile to us. And Faizi was very much aware of this fact, that torments come from the firmament. And he said that firmament, the sky, don't move so fast. Make a slow movement, because this is the night of union. And in this night of union, which is very short-lived night, let me enjoy life. Now, that moment being turned into eternity, that is what your philosophy teaches, that how we can transform a moment into eternity. That again reflected the mindset of Akbar, because Akbar was very much interested in philosophical discourses, and he would existentially would like to make the best use of it. He would make the best use of time. So here you have poet Faizi, who is trying to negotiate with the movement of the universe, the movement of the heavenly bodies, and say that and see that it doesn't move faster. And whatever given time he has, he wanted to make best use of that. That is why the period of Akbar is considered to be the golden period of Indian history, in the sense that Akbar had made best use of his time. Others could not. Again, you have another monarch who was by disposition, he was a painter. About Jahangir, it is said that if you present before him a piece of painting which was drawn by several painters, he would recognize each one of them by the stroke of their brush. That was the disposition or the inclination of the monarch. So the poet Talib Amuli, when you read his poetry, it is highly pictorial. His poetry would give you as if that there are pictures emerging from the poetry of Talib Amuli. Again, the third monarch which you could see here on the Mughal scene was Shah Jahan. We also have Shah Jahan here. Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan was famous for building edifices, for monuments. The famous Taj Mahal was built by him. The fort at Agra and Delhi was made by him. Even the city of Delhi was constructed at his command. So, what is important in architecture is brick. It is we lay brick upon brick in order to make a structure. So, in case of Kalim Kashani, who was his poet, if you read his poetry, I have given a specimen of his poetry, Kalim's specimen of his poetry, each word appears as a brick. That brick which gives birth to a monument. Similarly, all the words which are used by the poet Kalim Kashani, they appear more like a brick. They are very solid in their foundation, and the poetry which comes out during the Shah Jahani period appears to be very architectural in nature, or at least that is the visual effect we get from the poetry. And the last great Mughal was Aurangzeb, who was highly inimical to music. He had banned music during his reign. So as a reaction to that, we have a poet whose name was Bedil. The poetry of Bedil is nothing but a sonorous sound of Persian symphony. And there he talks about कि हमें उम्र बातो अदा ज़लीमों रफ़्त रंजे खुमार माँ चे क़यामती के नमी रसी ज़िकिनार माँ बेकिनार माँ. And you see the sonorous sound of his poetry. It was more a reaction to the dicta of Aurangzeb, who was banning the use of music. And another example which I have given about his poetry is beautiful. साज़मन आज़ादगी आहंगमन आवारगी अस्तालुक्ता नतवन बस कानून बा. My instrument is freedom, my song is bohemian, the symphony of music cannot bind my strings. That freedom which is celebrated by Bedil is beautiful. That freedom reminds me of Tagore, where he takes where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, where knowledge is free, where words come out from the depth of truth, where tireless striving stretches its hands towards perfection, where the clear stream of reason has not lost its way into the weary deserts of dead habit. Into that heaven of freedom, my father, let my country be. So you have in Persian poetry, it is not only a jingling sound which you hear, there is a cognitive richness where your intellectual input is really appreciated. Human intellect. The human intellect is beautifully portrayed in poetry in a most beautiful form. And the discourse of love and romance is there. The discourse of freedom is there. The discourse of social issues are there. All these things are beautifully celebrated in poetry. But then finally, you have Mirza Ghalib, who is considered to be one of the most important poets of 19th century Asia. Ghalib was a genius in the sense that his poetry is very much intellectual. He is one of the poets who appeals both to head and heart together. He knocks at human heart and human mind together. This is the beauty of Ghalib. Now Ghalib, what is important about Ghalib is that he says that what I can say at the gallows cannot be spoken from the pulpit. Now, audacity to speak the truth, to call the spade spade, is to be seen in Ghalib. Ghalib is one of the poets who has the audacity to tell the truth. He can speak to power. So, living in an age where Mughal rule is likely to end and British rule is likely to begin, and things were not clear on the horizon, Ghalib appears and he speaks, and the most important part of last two great poets of Indo-Persian literature are not in Urdu language, they are in Persian. They are primarily poets of Persian, namely Ghalib and Iqbal. And we celebrate Iqbal for his philosophy. The man of the poet of the East, Ghalib, Iqbal is considered to be the poet of the East, and his poetry is, as I said before you earlier, is more appealing in Persian and more resonating with our ethos in Persian rather than Urdu, where he is one of the poets who had the audacity to talk to God, and there he says that, "To Shab Afridi, you made the night, Chirag Afrida, I made the land. Bayabano Kosaro Rag Afridi, you made the wilderness, the meadows, and the mud. Khayabano Gulzaro Bag Afrida, I made the garden, the roads, and the cup. Mananam ke azahnoshin al. I am the one who can create, I can turn the poison into nectar. Mananam ke azahnoshin al. So the person who had the audacity to speak to God and who has given a dynamic notion of action and self, they are all the poets who have enriched the culture and civilization of Asia through their Persian poetry, and thus I conclude with it that Persian poetry is indeed a jewel in the crown of Asia. Thank you very much.